Oregon's rivers are turning into dumping grounds, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. Boats are sinking, breaking apart, and leaking chemicals straight into the water. And here's the wild part. This isn't a handful of bad owners. This is a statewide meltdown that's been growing silently for years, and the state barely keeping up. Every abandoned boat you see is a cost bomb waiting to explode. A cleanup bill, a hazard, a toxic mess. And the longer they sit, the more dangerous they get. But what's coming next is even worse, because this crisis has a financial curve nobody's ready for. The market crash. Oregon's rivers did not fill with abandoned boats overnight. The shift began slowly, the way most financial cracks do, quietly at first, then suddenly impossible to ignore. For years, older boats held just enough resale value for an owner to pass them along to the next person willing to take on the repairs. But when the used boat market collapsed, that chain snapped. Boats that once sold for a few $1,000s suddenly struggled to fetch even a few hundred. Private listings showed sellers slashing prices just to get a response, while repossessed vessels at auction went for less than the cost of towing them home. That drop created a painful financial equation. When a boat is worth less than the repairs it needs, the owner faces a choice: pour money into a vessel that will never pay it back, or walk away and hope nobody notices. More people chose the second option. The cost of fiberglass restoration, engine work, or hull patching often runs into the thousands. Meanwhile, the resale value of many older boats sank to nearly nothing. Once that gap opened, abandonment became the unintended escape route. Every abandoned hull you see along the Willamette or Columbia represents someone who realized the boat had turned from an asset into a liability. And when owners walk away, the problem does not stay personal. It lands directly on the public. But falling resale values were only the first break in the chain. The second was far more punishing, because keeping a boat alive has never been more expensive. The repair cost explosion. Once the market collapsed, the next blow came from an entirely different direction. The cost of keeping a boat afloat surged faster than most owners could keep up. Mechanic shortages spread across Oregon's coastal towns and river communities, pushing labor rates higher each season. Marine shops that once handled routine repairs now face long wait lists, leaving failing boats tied to docks for weeks or drifting on anchors, while owners hope nothing else breaks. Parts inflation made everything worse. A set of marine batteries that once cost under $200 now pushes past $400. Fuel system components, bilge pumps, propellers, and even basic wiring jumped in price as supply chains tightened. When repair invoices began hitting 3 or 4 times what owners remembered paying a decade earlier, many simply shut down and stopped fixing anything at all. Proof of this surge shows up in the repair quotes maintenance crews share. Several invoices now list totals that exceed the value of the entire vessel. When a boat is worth $2,000 but needs $3,000 in engine work just to stay functional, the numbers stop making sense. Owners who already struggled with rising housing costs and everyday expenses found themselves cornered. They did the only thing they felt they could do: they let the boat deteriorate where it sat. That slow decline accelerates abandonment, and every vessel that reaches that stage becomes another future cleanup bill waiting for the state to absorb. But repair costs were only part of the squeeze. Even owners willing to fix their boats discovered a harsher problem. There are fewer places left to do the work. If you want investigations like this to keep coming, make sure you like the video and subscribe so these issues stay visible. Share your thoughts in the comments and help push this crisis into the spotlight, where real accountability can finally begin. The disappearing shipyards. Repair prices are not the only barrier. Across Oregon, small shipyards that once served local boaters have been shutting down or scaling back. Some closed because they could not find enough skilled labor. Others closed because environmental compliance and land costs rose faster than their revenue. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. Fewer places exist to haul, inspect, or repair a vessel. When the infrastructure disappears, even willing owners can find themselves with nowhere to go. News reports from the past few seasons show a consistent pattern. Yard operators explain how rising insurance premiums, permitting demands, and low staffing made it impossible to continue. A shipyard that handled dozens of boats a year suddenly handles none. That leaves owners waiting months for a slot at the remaining facilities. When a yard tells someone they will need to wait until next summer for a haul out, the vessel continues to deteriorate in the water, and the repair bill grows. Those long wait times translate directly into higher abandonment rates. A wooden or fiberglass hull cannot sit untreated for a full season without risk of further damage. When an owner is told the repair window is months away and the cost will climb by the time their turn arrives, the financial logic becomes simple. Abandoning the vessel becomes the cheapest available path. But even when a boat finally fails, another issue makes the situation far more complicated: the lost paperwork. A major reason Oregon's rivers are filling with abandoned boats comes down to records, or more accurately, the lack of them. Many boats change hands in private sales with cash payments and no updated registration. Others pass through several temporary owners who never file paperwork, leaving no traceable chain. Some are bought at auction, used briefly, then resold informally, without proper documentation. Over time, these vessels become what state agencies call orphaned, meaning there is no confirmed owner on record who can be held responsible for repairs or removal. Statements from Oregon's Marine Board describe the scale of this problem. When a vessel washes up damaged or sinks unexpectedly, investigators often discover that the listed owner sold it years ago. The new owner never updated registration, and subsequent buyers left no documentation behind. With no official owner, there is no one to bill. That means the cost of removal does not land on the party who let the vessel fail. It lands on the state, and by extension, the public. This paperwork vacuum also encourages abandonment. When someone knows the vessel cannot be traced back to them, the financial risk disappears. Leaving a failing boat at anchor becomes easier because the consequences fall on everyone else. And each unclaimed vessel added to the river increases the overall cost facing the public. With every orphaned hull drifting into Oregon's waterways, the financial burden keeps shifting outward. The chemical mess. Every abandoned boat becomes a chemical liability the moment it is left to decay in Oregon's waterways. Fuel breaks down, solvents seep into the bilge, and aging batteries leak corrosive material directly into the river. Environmental contractors who respond to derelict vessel calls rarely arrive to a harmless situation. Instead, they find oily sheens spreading across the surface, pockets of contaminated bilge water, and residues from cleaners and paints used decades earlier. Spill reports from recent seasons along the Willamette and Columbia rivers show cleanup teams deploying absorbent booms, pumps, and containment barriers that quickly push the cost into the thousands. A small vessel with only a few gallons of diesel can still generate a cleanup bill of several $1,000s once testing, labor, and disposal fees are added. Those invoices do not wait for someone to claim responsibility. When ownership cannot be traced, the state steps in, because leaving contaminants in the water risks harming fish habitats, drinking water intake zones, and recreational areas. That means public funds are used to absorb the entire cost. Money that should support docks, ramps, patrols, or restoration work gets diverted to hazardous waste removal instead. One abandoned hull becomes another unplanned expense. And with dozens of these vessels scattered across the rivers, the financial pressure compounds quickly. Once chemical leaks strain environmental budgets, deeper problems emerge beneath the surface. The blocked shipping lanes. A sunken boat does not simply disappear from sight. It becomes a submerged obstacle that alters the movement of the vessels that keep Oregon's economy running. Barges, tugboats, supply vessels, and maintenance craft rely on consistent water depth and stable channels. When a derelict boat slips underwater, it often lands where commercial traffic is heaviest. Port Authority logs from the last several seasons document multiple cases where submerged wrecks forced cargo operators to slow down, reroute, or halt movement entirely. Coast Guard hazard notices reinforce this reality with repeated warnings issued after abandoned boats sank in the middle of transit corridors. Those delays carry measurable financial consequences. Fuel burns while vessels wait for clearance. Crews log extra hours, delivery schedules slip. Companies that rely on timely river transport must adjust pricing when their costs rise. When a barge carrying building materials or agricultural products faces repeated slowdowns caused by underwater hazards, the added expenses travel down the supply chain and eventually show up in consumer prices. A sunken hull may look like a localized inconvenience, but it creates a widening financial ripple that affects people far from the river's edge. While underwater wrecks slow commerce, drifting boats create a different kind of financial strain along the shoreline itself. The dock damage. Every drifting derelict threatens docks, marinas, pilings, and public boating facilities the moment it breaks free. A loose hull can wedge against a pier, strike a piling, or drag against a breakwater for hours before someone notices. Marina maintenance logs and insurance claims from the past few years show a rising number of incidents tied directly to abandoned boats. Repairs that once cost moderate amounts now reach into the thousands because labor rates have increased, and materials such as treated lumber, metal fasteners, and protective coatings have surged in price. When marinas repeatedly absorb these hits, insurance companies adjust premiums upward. That additional cost does not stay isolated within the facility. It flows directly into moorage rates, service fees, and operational budgeting. Boat owners who maintain their vessels responsibly end up paying more because of those who walked away. Even people without boats feel the effects when public docks or ramps require emergency repairs that stretch the budgets of local agencies. Waterfront infrastructure becomes more expensive to maintain, and the cost is shared across the community in higher fees, reduced access, or postponed improvements. If drifting boats damage structures during calm months, winter storms turn the problem into something far more destructive. The storm projectiles. Winter storms transform abandoned boats from static hazards into dangerous projectiles. When water levels rise and currents accelerate, a derelict vessel can break loose and travel downriver faster than response crews can react. Sheriff reports and emergency logs recount moments when unclaimed boats collided with bridges, piers, and shoreline properties during seasonal storms. A single impact can cause structural damage that requires engineering assessments, heavy machinery, and specialized labor to repair. Once debris removal, emergency overtime, and disposal fees are factored in, the cost can climb into the tens of thousands. These events repeatedly drain public budgets. Agencies responsible for river safety are forced to divert personnel and resources to chase drifting vessels during storm peaks when they are already stretched handling other emergencies. Communities pay for the work, the equipment, and the follow-up repairs. Each storm season becomes more expensive than the last because the number of derelict boats continues to rise. A vessel that might have sat quietly for months becomes a costly threat the moment current and wind take control. With each storm amplifying the damage, the long-term financial trajectory becomes impossible to ignore. The regulatory gap. For years, Oregon's regulations surrounding abandoned and derelict vessels remained several steps behind the reality on the water. Older laws treated derelict boats as occasional nuisances rather than a consistent, statewide problem, and that slow response allowed hundreds of neglected vessels to accumulate quietly on rivers and back channels. The legislative update known as House Bill 2914 helped modernize the process, but its arrival came after years of inaction. The older rules required long waiting periods, lengthy notifications, and unclear enforcement authority. By the time agencies could intervene, the vessels were often sinking, leaking, or already abandoned with no identifiable owner. The proof is visible in the timeline itself. House Bill 2914 was passed only after repeated warnings from marine patrols, port authorities, and community groups who documented growing clusters of derelict hulls. Reports submitted in the years leading up to the bill showed rising cleanup costs and longer removal delays, yet legislation moved slowly. During that gap, the number of vessels needing intervention multiplied. The financial consequence is now unavoidable. Because the state waited so long to modernize the law, today's cleanup bills are significantly higher than they would have been a decade ago. The longer a vessel sits, the more expensive it becomes to remove. Delayed action transformed a manageable issue into a costly backlog that will take years to restore. But even with better rules in place, the money needed to enforce them is falling short. The funding hole. The derelict vessel crisis is not simply a story of policy delays. It is also a direct result of limited funding reaching the agencies responsible for maintaining Oregon's waterways. The Oregon State Marine Board manages many of these responsibilities, but its budget relies heavily on registration fees, small grants, and occasional federal assistance. Those sources were never designed to absorb the rising cost of abandoned vessel removals. Financial summaries from recent seasons show the Marine Board using a substantial portion of its project funds to address derelict boats, leaving less money available for patrols, safety programs, and maintenance. This shortfall places pressure on several fronts. When public funds cannot cover removal costs, the state seeks grants, but those grants are limited and competitive. Federal support arrives inconsistently, leaving year-to-year uncertainty. Meanwhile, each removal can cost thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the vessel's size and complexity. When the state faces a gap, it has only a few ways to fill it, and most of those options involve raising fees or shifting costs back toward local governments. The financial impact is starting to spread. Registration fees are under discussion for increases, and local jurisdictions are already facing situations where they must use their own budgets to address drifting or sunken boats. That means taxpayers, even those with no connection to boating, may see higher local costs tied indirectly to derelict vessels. The limited funding available creates a cycle in which each year's removals drain the pool further, and rising expenses push fees and taxes upward. While funding gaps create stress, the ability to enforce existing laws adds another layer of difficulty. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe. These stories are unfolding faster than most people realize, and staying informed is the only way to understand what's coming next. Your attention helps ensure these hidden dangers never stay buried or ignored again. The weak enforcement. Even with updated legislation and growing public concern, enforcement agencies face challenges that limit how quickly they can respond to derelict vessels. Marine patrol units across Oregon operate with small teams responsible for vast stretches of river. These patrols must monitor boating safety, respond to emergencies, track unregistered vessels, and enforce anchoring limits that restrict how long a boat may remain in one location. Reports from sheriff departments show that enforcement workload continues to rise, even as staffing levels remain steady or shrink. Complicating matters further, loopholes in anchoring rules allow vessels to move short distances to reset the enforcement clock. A boat anchored for 30 days simply needs to shift slightly upriver to extend its stay, and repeated moves make it difficult for patrols to establish abandonment. Marine Board memos illustrate how these loopholes give failing vessels time to deteriorate before intervention is legally possible. The financial consequences grow with each delay. When enforcement cannot act early, vessels remain on the water long past the point where small maintenance issues become major failures. A boat that could have been removed easily becomes a complex salvage job requiring cranes, divers, and hazardous waste handling. Each day of delay adds to the eventual cost, and those rising bills eventually flow back into public budgets. And even when enforcement reaches a failing vessel, finding the responsible owner creates another costly obstacle: the owner maze. At the core of Oregon's derelict vessel crisis is a problem that predates many of the current laws: the ownership maze. Boats often change hands informally, through quick sales, cash deals, or off-record transfers. Many older vessels lack updated titles, and some never had proper documentation to begin with. When a vessel is finally abandoned, locating the true owner becomes a near impossible task. Marine Board statements describe dozens of unrecoverable vessels each year, meaning no confirmed owner exists to bill for removal. This creates a financial dead end. Without a responsible party, the state cannot recover any of the costs associated with towing, dismantling, or disposing of the vessel. In some cases, the last registered owner is deceased or moved out of state decades earlier. In others, records show a chain of incomplete transfers with no verified endpoint. Each investigation consumes time and resources, and most of them lead nowhere. The cost burden eventually lands on the public. When ownership cannot be established, removal becomes a public obligation. Agencies must fund the entire operation, from initial inspection to final disposal. The more orphaned vessels accumulate, the heavier the load becomes on local and state budgets. This ownership maze turns every abandoned boat into a long-term financial liability that communities must absorb. With enforcement limited, funding strained, and ownership unclear, the system's weaknesses shape the cost trajectory for years ahead. The last resort, houseboats. Along Oregon's rivers, many of the boats drifting near the bank are not weekend toys or forgotten hobby projects. They have become the last housing option for people priced out of traditional rentals. Rising housing costs, shrinking vacancies, and increasing living expenses have pushed some individuals toward the water, where an older boat purchased for a few $100s can feel like a temporary refuge. Interviews with community outreach workers show that many people living aboard these vessels deal daily with problems most boat owners would consider emergencies. Failing engines, leaking roofs, and unstable wiring are common, yet repairs are out of reach because they require money, parts, and dry dock access, three things these boat residents rarely have. As these vessels sit in the water without maintenance, deterioration accelerates. Hulls soften, batteries corrode, and structural supports weaken, turning each boat into a time-sensitive liability. The longer someone relies on one of these aging vessels as shelter, the more expensive the eventual removal becomes once it sinks or becomes uninhabitable. That cost does not fall on the person living aboard, who usually has no financial means to cover it. Instead, public funds absorb the full bill. Each failing boat becomes another line item in a growing backlog of cleanup obligations that communities must manage. But while people aboard these vessels face a personal struggle, the workers tasked with removing them face a different kind of pressure entirely: the cleanup crew reality. The crews contracted to remove derelict boats work at the intersection of environmental safety, heavy industry, and public responsibility. Marine contractors, salvage divers, crane operators, and hazardous material specialists have seen firsthand how quickly a neglected vessel becomes dangerous. Contractors hired by the state describe boats filled with rotted frames, collapsed bulkheads, soaked insulation, and unknown fluids standing in the bottom of the hull. Every removal becomes its own complicated project, requiring planning, specialized gear, and a team trained to handle unpredictable conditions. The famous dredge dismantling, which cost more than $1 million, showed just how intensive the process can be. Workers had to secure the vessel, prevent leakage, dismantle sections safely, and transport debris for disposal, all while avoiding contamination. That level of work is becoming more common. As more vessels deteriorate beyond repair, removal crews spend longer hours in harsher conditions, using more equipment and taking on greater physical risk. Every added step increases labor hours, disposal fees, and logistical expenses, making removal steadily more expensive. Workers frequently report that many derelict boats reach them only after years of neglect. By the time they arrive on scene, the vessel has deteriorated to the point where there is no salvage value, only risk, cost, and urgency. Those rising expenses fall back onto public budgets that were never designed to sustain these operations at such volume. While today's cleanup efforts are already stretched thin, the financial outlook for the decade ahead raises even larger concerns. The 2030 forecast. Looking ahead, projections for Oregon's waterways through the year 2030 paint a challenging financial picture. The number of vessels reaching the end of their usable life is expected to rise as the aging recreational fleet continues to wear down. Many of these boats were built decades ago, and without consistent maintenance, they are entering the final stage of their service life. Meanwhile, seasonal storms are becoming more intense, pushing already weakened vessels past their breaking point. Trend analysis shows abandoned vessels may double soon, with cleanup costs doubling or tripling as storms and high water push more boats to sink or break loose. Agencies already struggle to keep up, and a larger backlog would overwhelm tight state budgets. Without new strategies, essential critical funds for access, safety, and maintenance will be diverted into non-stop vessel cleanup. Beyond the direct financial implications, a growing backlog of derelict vessels affects how residents experience Oregon's waterways. Reduced patrol presence, delayed cleanup operations, and strained budgets create a landscape where problems take longer to address and costs rise steadily. The future will depend heavily on whether the system adapts quickly enough to slow the trajectory. The fix that must happen. Preventing communities from carrying the long-term financial weight of abandoned vessels requires addressing several systemic weaknesses. Program data shows that ownership tracking remains inconsistent, leaving agencies unable to identify responsible parties when a vessel fails. Registration enforcement varies by region, allowing older boats to slip through the system without updated paperwork. Disposal options remain limited and costly, making it easier for struggling owners to leave a vessel behind than to remove it responsibly. Funding gaps widen each year. Many of the programs responsible for preventing abandonment operate with limited resources and fluctuating grant support. Until those gaps close, agencies will continue operating in reaction mode rather than prevention mode, expanding disposal assistance programs, improving registration compliance, and allowing earlier intervention when vessels show signs of failure could reduce long-term costs significantly. Without meaningful change, abandoned vessels will keep shifting costs onto communities, draining funds meant for access, protection, and safety. Fixing the root issues, clear ownership, real enforcement, and steady funding is the only way to stabilize expenses before they surge further and turn Oregon's waterways into an even heavier financial burden ahead. Oregon's abandoned boat crisis isn't slowing down, and if nothing changes, the cleanup bill and the environmental damage are only going to get worse. These rivers matter to every community that depends on them, and the more people understand what's happening, the harder it becomes for officials to ignore it. So if this opened your eyes, hit like to push this story further. Drop a comment with what you think needs to change. I read every one. And if you want more deep dives like this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.